to order. Welcome to meeting number 10 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on International Trade. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of September 23rd, 2020. The proceedings are available via the House of Commons website. To ensure an orderly meeting, I would like to outline a few rules that we've heard many times. Members and witnesses may speak in the official language of their choice. Interpretation services are available for this meeting. You have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either Floor, English, or French. For members participating in person, proceed as you usually would when the whole committee is meeting in person in a committee room. Keep in mind the directives from the Board of Internal Economy regarding the health protocols and for masking. Before speaking, please wait until I recognize you by name. If you were on the video conference, please click on the microphone icon to unmute yourself. Those in the room, your microphone will be controlled as normal by the proceedings and verification officer, as you all know very well. When you are not speaking, your mic should be on mute. So on to pursuant to the Standing Order 1082, the committee will now proceed with the study of Canada's recovery plan for exporters after COVID-19. And as our witnesses today, we welcome from the Canadian American Business Council, Mary Scott Greenwood, Chief Executive Officer, and from the Trade Justice Network, Angela McEwen, Co-Chair, and Eddie Perez, International Policy Analyst, Climate Action Network Canada. So to our witnesses, we're very glad to have you with us today. Ms. Greenwood, would you like to lead off, please?
Sure thing. Good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the committee. Il est un grand plaisir d'être parmi vous aujourd'hui. It has been a while since we last met. You know, the pandemic, when it arrived 10 months ago, it triggered a powerful mix of emotions and instincts. It's just human nature. Individually, we scrambled to protect ourselves and our families, and then had to cope with isolation and fear that resulted. And our governments went into protective crouches. They began competing with one another for personal protective equipment and other crucial supplies, and ultimately began to turn inward. It was all understandable enough. The coronavirus disrupted entire sectors of the economy and robbed millions of their livelihoods, not to mention lives. In those circumstances, it was natural for governments to resolve that the health and jobs of their own citizens came first and to fashion arrangements accordingly. But it was ultimately counterproductive, especially where the United States and Canada are concerned. I don't have to explain to any members of this committee the extent to which our economies are integrated. In many ways, we are now one economy, and it's a fantastically successful model. Look, if Ontario were a sovereign nation, it would be America's third biggest trading partner, and it's the number one trading partner of 19 states. Alberta provides nearly half of America's crude oil imports, and more than 87% of US aluminum imports come from Quebec, and those, by the way, are low carbon. I could go on. So I got together with the Quebec Delegate General in New York, Catherine Louvier, and we came up with the North American Rebound Campaign. Our message was pretty simple, and we think pretty effective. It was, we are in this together, and we need each other to get through it. If the New England states could get together and form a co-op of sorts to secure personal protective equipment, why couldn't Quebec be part of that group? And for that matter, why not the whole of Canada and the US? We started contacting like-minded people in Canada and the US to support us. As the CEO of the Canadian American Business Council, my Rolodex, if I can still use that term, is full of people who understand the profound need for mutual reliance. Since we launched the North American Rebound campaign in May, we've signed up over 1,000 Canadian and American business leaders, 140 prominent business and industry associations in both countries, from Kansas to California, from Arizona to Atlanta. We've reached 150,000 people on social media, and we've managed nearly 113 million impressions in print media so far. The people who signed on to the North American Rebound believe that both countries must maintain a strong, common cross-border manufacturing response until this pandemic is brought under control, and in fact, in the economic recovery that will follow. We need to collaborate on securing personal protective equipment. We must design Canada-US solutions to maintain and replenish strategic stockpiles of medical equipment. The common border must remain open to essential business. Our supply chains cannot be interrupted. And we have to find smart, safe, risk-based ways to reopen the border ultimately. And we have to continue what we've been doing now for decades, expanding market opportunities for each other. That is crucial for recovery and to compete globally once we move past this pandemic. And we will continue to work with the new Biden administration and the 117th Congress, and of course, this Parliament. There's a lot of talk these days about building back smarter. For our two countries, rebounding together is the smartest move of all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Greenwood. On to Ms. McEwen, please.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the committee for inviting me to appear here on behalf of the Trade Justice Network. We are a coalition of environmental, civil society, student, Indigenous, cultural, farming, labor, and social justice organizations. We came together in 2010 to call for a new global trade regime founded on social justice, human rights, and environmental sustainability. Our members include such organizations as the Canadian Labour Congress, Unifor, the Canadian Union of Public Employees, the United Steelworkers, the Climate Action Network of Canada, the National Farmers Union, and many other groups who represent people in Canada from all walks of life. I will focus my remarks around the role that we see international trade deals and policy playing in a just recovery from COVID-19 and ensuring that Canada is well prepared to cope with a future crisis. First, we have seen the importance of maintaining domestic manufacturing capacity in Canada for a number of essential goods, such as personal protective equipment and vaccines. Buy Canada procurement policies may be necessary to recover and promote existing companies in Canada with that capacity. So it will be important for federal legislators to keep this in mind as they engage in any bilateral trade negotiations or as they have talks within international trade organizations, such as the World Trade Organization. We also want to make sure that we have the capacity to bring back publicly owned businesses, as in the case of vaccines, that could do this work and make sure that our hands are not tied behind our backs because we didn't take this possibility into account. Regulatory harmonization is a key part of the new NAFTA and CITA, two of our major trade deals. And we should be particularly cautious as we proceed here that we are able to maintain the freedom to respond appropriately to future crises in health, climate, and the economic fallout that comes from these crises. Right now, the federal government is exploring what it means to have feminist foreign policy, and we congratulate you for this. We want to note, though, that it doesn't simply mean token exclusions for women-owned businesses in trade agreements. We want to remind you that gender equity, especially in terms of education and employment, contributes to economic growth. But the reverse is not true. Economic growth does not on its own contribute to gender equality or to improvements in health, welfare, or basic rights. Finally, we think that as we're planning our future in trade, it's important to think about how our trade policy fits in with other international commitments, such as the Sustainable Development Goals and the United Nations Declaration on the Right of Indigenous Peoples. If we take our commitment to the SDGs seriously, we would do an impact assessment before finalizing any deal of the social and economic consequences of the agreement that it will have on participating nations' ability to progress towards the SDGs. Also, in implementing UNDRIP, we should consider what that means for including First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people at the bargaining table during international trade negotiations. I'd like to...
J'aimerais maintenant donner la parole à Eddie Perez. Merci beaucoup, Angela. Merci.
Merci beaucoup pour l'invitation aujourd'hui. D'abord,
Thank you very much for the invitation to speak today. I'd like to recognize that right now I'm in Judege, which is commonly known as Montreal. I would like to begin by saying that in 2020, as we're experiencing this devastating crisis, we're also celebrating the 5th anniversary of one agreement and the 30th anniversary, about 31 years since the climate regime was undertaken. The 5th anniversary of the Paris Accord. Now, I'd like to complement what my colleague said by talking about the climate. COVID-19 has confronted us and weakened us to a point where we discovered lots of vulnerabilities and weaknesses in the systems governing us. We have understood that from a climate point of view, also from fairness and ecological transition, the choice we have in front of us is not whether or not to decide if we want to transition. The choice is how ambitious are we going to be in what we do, and what are the risks that we are imposing on future generations through the kinds of policies, for example, that the Canadian Parliament is adopting. For free trade, COVID-19 has a direct impact on the industries which depend on China for global supply, especially energy support as well. They've been impacted by COVID-19, but also by all kinds of policies which have led to a drop in oil prices, 21% in March 2021 compared to a year earlier. And we've seen a drop in imports and exports for car parts, machinery, and electronics. This leads us to an important conclusion. Canada is an exporting country, an energy exporter. And now I'm going to switch into English.
Heavily impact the fossil fuel sector. Restrictions in economic and social activity and travel triggered the biggest shock to global fossil fuel consumption in 7 decades. And the oil prices plunged to historic lows in some places. Countries reliant on oil revenues found themselves saddled with additional hardship in the midst of the health crisis. In fact, that all just shows that in the context of Canada, we continue living under the impression that we could both meet Paris Agreement goals and increase coal, oil, and gas production. Accepting that reality is not something I see this Parliament do, as it oversees the future of Canada's trade policy during the recovery. Canada has already committed to global net zero emissions in 2050 in a country that has never met its emissions target. And we feel it is the role of Parliament to analyze and address the incoherent approach that suggests that Canada could meet its climate goals while at the same time project an increase of 6.4 million barrels per day or 187 billion cubic meters of gas through fracking in 2030. So the trend of decarbonization is moving rapidly with economies around the world committing to stronger climate ambition. That means that trade and foreign policy will be impacted both by climate action, but also by climate impacts, and will particularly impact oil-producing countries like Canada. Actually, the IEA has said that producers could lose up to $7 trillion US dollars by 2040 as economies decarbonize. Economies unwilling to diversify will face higher economic and geopolitical instability. So let me just conclude.
Closing remarks, Mr. Perez, please.
Yes, we'll go into the closing remarks. And I think the role of Parliament as we look forward to modernizing and transforming Canada's trades and respond to the COVID pandemic is to help us understand how trade can be used as a tool for responding to global threats, enhancing climate action, and protecting those key non-negotiable priorities that we saw during this COVID: health, social safety nets, the rights of workers, gender equality, and the rights of Indigenous people.
Thank you, Mr. Perez. On to Mr. Hoback for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you all witnesses for being here on a Friday. It was nice of you to attend. You know, when we started looking at this is a scenario where we thought the WTO was going to possibly fall apart. We weren't sure who was going to be elected president of the United States. We were seeing issues on PPEs and protectionism around that. We're hearing issues of countries grouping together where Canada wasn't part of those groups and making sure that they took care of each other. So, you know, one of the things that I was always kind of curious about is during the COVID-19 crisis, COVID-19 is going to be with us even once we're vaccinated, but as we progress down this path now with people getting vaccinated, how do we proceed? And what are the structural things that actually have changed here and now because of COVID? And I think because of a new election in the U.S. with the new president will also structurally change things. And what are the things we should be looking for? So I'll start off with you, Ms. Greenwood. You talked about your North American rebound. How do we take something that should have been done in the last CUSMA agreement, which was bringing us closer together, but unfortunately the minds weren't at the table to do that. But I think now we can actually do that. So what are the types of things we should be looking at? And I'll use the example of PPEs. Like, should there be an agreement that not necessarily that it all be built in Saskatchewan or all be built in Canada, but maybe we have certain things like this always being built in North America?
Excuse Mr. Hoback. Mr. McEwen, could you please mute your mic? Okay, thank you very much. My apologies, Mr. Hoback. Please continue.
Okay, Ms. Greenwood.
Thank you, Mr. Herbeck, for the comment and the question. I think there are a number of specific models we could look at, and we've been promoting them, but they're more poignant now. So, for example, Canada and the United States have a memorandum of understanding with respect to defense procurement. We've had it since the 1960s, actually. And what it says is it's part of the U.S. Defense Production Sharing Agreement. And what it says is that for the purposes of Pentagon procurement, Canada should be treated as domestically and vice versa. So if there are Canadian suppliers for defense contracts, they should be able to bid on an equal playing field with American suppliers. We think this model, which has worked very well in that sector for several decades now, is a good model to look at for PPE procurement, and for other, everything else really in the economic rebuild. So in other words, we think that Canada and the United States should treat each other as if we were domestic for the purposes of government contracts. That would apply to infrastructure. We went through another way to look at this is if you go back to 2008 with the economic crisis at that time, there was the investment in the economy to try to prevent economic collapse. And there was a Canadian exemption to the Buy American provisions. Ultimately, that was kind of hard fought, but we got there. So I think the idea is if we can treat each other domestically for the purposes of procurement, that would go a long ways to address the kind of challenges that you identify.
You think we need to take it to another level? Like, do we need to look at things like rare earth elements, things that we look at and say, you know what, we don't want to be beholden to anybody other than the people we really trust? Are those the types of things that we should be also looking at going forward?
Absolutely, and that's another area that our organization has been talking about quite a lot. Canada's expertise in responsibly developing and producing resources and its infrastructure, whether it's railroads, ports, things like that, and just engineering ingenuity. All of these years, whether it's uranium, aluminum, etc., oil sands, could be brought to bear, and Canada could be a leading supplier of critical minerals and rare earth processing for the U.S. and world markets. And by the way, that's important when we think about the transition to a low carbon future, because when you think about electric vehicles, solar panels, those things involve rare earth minerals. We need to be good at recycling them. We need to be good at producing them, and we in North America should not, in our opinion, be reliant on the monopoly from China, which is where the overwhelming majority of these resources are produced, and they're done in a way that's quite toxic and harmful to the environment. So yes, couldn't agree with you more that rare earths would be an ideal area of collaboration for our two countries.
Now, how do you see us working together in regards to all sorts of possible barriers being put up, non-tariff trade barriers with historical trading partners? Is this something where Canada and the U.S. can work together on as we see companies trying to protect their domestic supply and breaking agreements that they've made with us in the past? How do you see that working? Do you see it as a possibility, or is that just too far out there?
Well, no, at least with respect to Canada and the United States, this is exactly why we launched the North American Rebound Campaign. We wanted to talk to chambers of commerce and businesses on each side, civil society on each side, to say, do you think we should collaborate? And the answer was yes. I mean, we have 654,400 chambers across the U.S. currently that are saying to our political leadership, it's important that we can, the United States, collaborate on these things together. So I think there's a willingness and an openness. We've got to engage with each other. We've got to talk about it. But I do think that what you're talking about is exactly why we launched the North American Rebound a few months ago.
Can you give me an example of some of the possible new threats we could be facing post-COVID?
Well, protectionism, is always a concern, and the idea that when the new Biden-elected administration takes office and the 117th Congress comes, the very natural instinct to say, look, if we're going to spend a lot of government dollars, a lot of American taxpayer dollars, let's make sure that we first give those opportunities to American suppliers. That's understandable, and that's a real possibility. And so what we have to do is really continue to talk about. Great if you can find a domestic source, whether you're Canadian or U.S. Fantastic. But if you don't have in your supply chain the ability to source domestically, aluminum is a perfect example. 80% of and aluminum is used ubiquitously, right? Think of all the products that have aluminum. We just don't have capacity in the United States. 87% of aluminum comes actually from Canada. So, or I should say 87% of Canadian imports come here. Anyway,
Thank you, Ms. Greenwood. Thank you very much.
Sure.
On to Mr. Sheehan for 6 minutes.
Well, thank you very much to the presenters for their excellent presentations and this very important work that we're undertaking. And as I was doing my sound check, I mentioned that I am from Sault Ste. Marie, and we've been talking in the presentations about supply chains, and Sault Ste. Marie is a resource city. There's many of them across this country. It is based around steel, the second largest steel producer in Canada here. So both the upstream and downstream supply chains are absolutely critically important to a lot of cities, including the one that I represent. So my question through you, Madam Chair, to our presenters is, can you tell us how the government's efforts to keep supply chains open throughout COVID-19 pandemic has helped our exporters? Are there any additional measures you'd like to see the government to make for the movement of goods across our borders so it's smoother and more efficient while ensuring it is still safe for Canadians? Because that is also at a border town, it's a very, very challenging, is because we need to keep that $2 billion in trade crossing. But obviously, when we take a look at just what's happening over in Chippewa County with the surge, we have to keep it safe and we have to keep it moving. But are there other additional measures we can take to keep our supply chains moving? And I'm thinking of things like the wage subsidy, which originally, like Algoma Steel, Tenaris tubes weren't eligible for, that are. They told me that it really helped them stay open. So through you, Madam Chair, to our presenters.
Whoever would like to answer that, Ms. McEwen?
Well, I can answer briefly, but I think Ms. Greenwood might have some more useful information. So the wage subsidy is quite problematic because it's been difficult to target it well to producers, and so some people, as you say, weren't eligible for it that needed it, and some people are getting it, and we're basically subsidizing businesses that would have been profitable anyway, and so it's very difficult to make that work. Although the CERB, it has been excellent because everybody who got it was laid off for lost time, right? So the CERB was much better targeted than the wage subsidy. I certainly think that rent, helping any businesses manage the rent is going to be key to helping businesses stay afloat. And so that's not the supply chain per se, but that's helping businesses make it through here, right? Because I think everybody's having a tough time paying rent. Obviously, with Biden being elected in the United States, that will hopefully help you make health measures in the states, and that will help us have safer trade with them as well. But that has been the key thing, that the numbers in the United States are just so much higher than they are in Canada that it's quite difficult to do it safely.
Mr. Sheehan or Ms. Greenwood, did you want to add something to that, to Mr. Sheehan's question?
I'm happy to if you'd like me to, but I can yield back if up to you. think he's saying yes. So in terms of,
Mr. Sheehan, you're on mute.
Sorry. Thank you. And in particular on the supply chains, from your experience, what has worked well, and what potentially could be improved?
Thank you very much. So on supply chains, getting rid of retaliatory tariffs is obviously very important. And Canada and the United States have been working on that, but hopefully that we will not see threats of steel and aluminum tariffs coming out of the U.S. administration again anytime soon. So that's a positive. What could work better, keeping the border open for essential commerce has been really important, but it hasn't worked perfectly. It is still difficult and unpredictable to get people, human beings back and forth across it. And it is important to do that in a risk-based way. I would say the pilot project that Alberta is looking at for travel is worth looking at. So leaning into testing and making sure that if somebody tests negative before they leave and when they enter, you can reduce the quarantine period is something that actually helps supply chains, because we're running into people not being able to get across the border to deliver goods that have been ordered and that sort of thing. I also think, to Ms. McEwen's point, the Biden administration announced, I think yesterday or today, that, for example, it'll have 100 days, the first 100 days of its administration, there will be a national mask requirement. So hopefully measures that are taken in the United States in particular will be helpful in fighting the bug, but also will give leaders confidence that we can resume and build, rebound our supply chains in a way that's helpful. The big, certain big legacy projects, you just can't relocate and reshore. Steel is a good example, and aluminum is another. You've got to be able to, Canada and the United States do so well together. We should figure out how to keep doing that, not figure out how to pull apart from each other, in our judgment.
A short question, Mr. Sheehan.
Yeah. Have you ever reached out to the Canada Trade Commission Services for advice, and what was your experiences, and any thoughts for any improvements on that particular organization?
We work pretty well with the Canadian trade commissioners that are based in the U.S. and their headquarters in Ottawa. I'm not sure if that's the organization you're talking about.
Yep.
But they work really hard and I think are strong advocates for Canadian businesses in the U.S. I don't have experience in other parts of the world, but I think it's a very useful and helpful tool that Canadian businesses in particular, when they come into the United States, have.
Thank you very much. On
Thank
to
you.
Mr. Savard-Tremblay for 6 minutes.
Bonjour, salutations, merci à l'ensemble.
Hello, welcome, and thank you to all of our witnesses today. I'd like to speak to Mr. Perez because of the fundamental importance of the environment issue. I think that we have to make a connection. We're looking at a post-COVID world, and this has been a long pandemic. It's continuing to be lengthy. We're not out of the woods yet. And if we have to understand that there may be others. We know that there's all kinds of viruses and bacteria and germs who are in the polar ice cap. And so any climate change would necessarily lead to the melting of the polar ice and probably a freeing of new kinds of disease. So we will probably be faced with other pandemics if we don't act as quickly as possible. So this is one connection that we can make. Now, you were talking about the idea that commercial agreements should be limited to environmental agreements. And let's say, for example, if we go beyond the idea of referring in the text to anything, but should we have legal mechanisms, binding mechanisms? How should we express it, actually? Thank you very much for your question. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. First of all, there's a major finding. Even if we are able to refer the climate objectives and keep them in or put them into trade agreements, as we've done with the last 4 trade agreements, we call the first 6 at the Canada side, this did not bring the free trade and environmental regimes any closer together. what ended up happening, well, it was an illustration of the extent to which the current free trade rules are not sufficient to address the environmental crisis. There are several reasons for this, and this is why we cannot resolve the issue of fossil fuel subsidies, and we think that we have to add something, a provision for border adjustments or CPAM, because there's a basic inequity in the way in which nations are applying environmental policy. And this indicates a disparity between the free trade regime and the climate regime. So nations and parliaments have to note this and decide what to do about it. I'm fairly optimistic, and I'm happy that Ms. Greenwood is here. Given that there's a new government in the U.S., there could be some discussions about how trade rules can, in fact, help not only to strengthen, first and foremost, the current treaties, because I think that Canada and the U.S. have similar approaches in terms of strengthening environmental policies. But how can we discuss a sharing in terms of free trade, which could lead to further decarbonization of the economy, and thereby permit a fair transition for workers and for communities? So the first question we have to ask is, who are the people, the stakeholders who can lead us to have trade rules which are common? Well, there's the U.S., there's, the urban milieus who are thinking about this. And then the other thing is to think about the carbon plug. In other words, countries who are ready to use the free trade credits to have more ambitious climate policies. Now, you were saying that states don't apply these things in the same way. Is this as a form of unfair competition? In other words, a product which is produced in, or merchandise which is produced in conditions which are less eco-responsible than those produced elsewhere can end up coming to market with a lower cost or lower price. This would be an unfair competition. Yes, absolutely. What you're saying is not something that we see. There's no transparency at all. When you talk about border adjustment provisions, there's a total lack of transparency in terms of what is behind a product. In this case, one of the major objectives, and in the current situation, we're talking about Canada, we have to think not only about the economic evaluation in a free trade agreement, but as I've already said, the environmental issue of human rights, labor rights. As you've said yourself, we're in a pandemic context today, and these should be things that are non-negotiable.
Your time is up.
All right, we'll see you next time.
On to Mr. Blakey, please.
Thank you very much. Ms. McEwen, I understand there's been a proposal at the WTO out of India and South Africa for the suspension of the TRIPS provisions in order to allow for countries to be able to not have to observe some of the normal restrictions around intellectual property and things like that for the purposes of their domestic COVID response. I'm just wondering if you could talk to the committee a little bit about that, if it's something that you're familiar with, and let us know whether or not you think that that's an important initiative for the committee to endorse as part of our study on the effects of COVID on and Canada's global trade position.
Absolutely. And Mr. Blinky, if you haven't already, you and other critics will probably soon be getting a letter from QB, where I work, and from the Trade Justice Network, supporting the this goal of making sure that lower income nations have the ability to afford to make vaccines without paying exorbitant prices. And so We absolutely support that. We think that it's consistent with Canada's goals in terms of, I know that the meeting is coming up very soon. It's on December 10th. So I think it would be fantastic if the Trade Committee could itself endorse the waiver for certain provisions of the TRIPS agreement, because we know that without this waiver, pharmaceutical companies will be able to prevent manufacturers from producing these vaccines and medicines and scaling up the production. And since it's a global pandemic, we really need all hands on deck. And it's a very special, I think, moment for us to extend this solidarity to countries that can't afford to pay the pharmaceutical companies and to make sure that they're able to vaccinate. I think through the Doha Declaration on Public Health, governments have recognized that it's important to have flexibility in terms of serious public health crises. So I think it's both consistent with our positions in other areas, and it's an important part of our role and responsibility as a global citizen.
Thank you. So just to summarize, this would be a really meaningful way that Canada could assist other countries in the global response to
yes,
COVID.
Thank you for being concise and summarizing. That's exactly what I mean.
And could you confirm what the cost to Canadian taxpayers would be of Canada endorsing this? Would there be any direct cost to the Canadian Treasury in order to endorse this?
No, this is something where pharmaceutical companies will forego profit. But as there's been much discussion, Canada doesn't have manufacturing capacity for any of those. So there is absolutely no cost to the Canadian Treasury or the Canadian people.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. I appreciate it. I also understand that there's been a considerable movement. I know we've received a lot of correspondence about it. People calling for at least a temporary suspension of investor state dispute settlement clauses in trade agreements in order to help facilitate government responses to COVID, and understanding that some flexibility will be required as states undertake to rebuild their national economies. I'm just wondering if you could speak a little bit to that movement, of which I know the Trade Justice Network has been a part, and the importance of that, and whether you'd like to see this committee endorse that initiative as well.
Yes, that's something that we support. In fact, we think that modern trade agreements, like the new NAFTA that we've negotiated, that we should be moving away from ISDS in those agreements. It prioritizes one thing above a whole host of other considerations that we think include, the government's responsibility in terms of public health and to be able to respond in crises in ways that make sense, without then being afraid that they're on the hook for frivolous lawsuits from other companies. So we think that both it makes sense right now to temporarily suspend any ISDS measures, but also as we move forward in negotiations, like we were quite upset to see that the UK agreement still had something around an investor court in it when that hasn't actually been finalized in CIIT yet even. So we think that the way forward in trade agreements is move away from ISDS, because it's just proven so much a barrier to progress on climate, on human rights, on Indigenous rights, that there's no excuse for keeping it anymore.
A very short question, Mr. Blakey, and a short answer.
Well, I just would say that I shared your disappointment to learn that there would be an ISDS provision in the Canada-UK agreement. We're still, of course, waiting for the details of that because we haven't seen the text of the agreement. I wonder if you shared my surprise, given the positive comments that Minister Freeland had made during the CUSMA debate about removing ISDS, and how that was one of the things she was most proud of in the CUSMA negotiation.
Yes, I have to say that I was quite surprised that we worked closely with Minister Freeland as part of CITA negotiations and Trans-Pacific Partnership when she was the trade minister responsible for those things. And I was given her personal position on it that she had voiced repeatedly. I was quite surprised to see that Canada is still pushing forward in this and lots of other agreements like Mercosur and the UK deal.
Thank you very much, Ms. McEwen. On to Mr. Abutai for 5 minutes.
Well,
Well, thank all witnesses for appearing today. Ms. Greenwood, you mentioned at the beginning about Alberta energy, Alberta oil, and that was one of the elements of a great trade relationship with the United States. Do you believe that this government, our government, should put on top of mind the energy as to be able to set the stage for economic rebound?
Pardon me, do I believe the government should do what to energy?
Should have energy on top of mind when it
top of
comes
mind.
to when it comes to economic recovery.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much. I think that energy, whether it's traditional fossil fuels, whether it's renewable energy, whether it's innovative future forms, is a crucial part of the economy regardless. So I do think that when we talk about economic recovery, we have to think in terms of all forms of energy, and I know that the Biden administration is looking at sustainability in a number of areas, including infrastructure. So just as a quick example, um, there is some Canadian innovation about carbon capture and utilization. And there's a Canadian company that I'm aware of that captures carbon out of the air and is able to put it into a nanotube that you can mix into cement. So imagine building infrastructure which also has the ability to help the economy recover, but also help deal with carbon. So I do think it's a top of mind issue on economic recovery. Yes, sir.
Well, thank you. I'm a member from Edmonton, from Alberta, and we've been always leaders when it comes to technologies, especially in oil and gas sector. And you mentioned the new department or new administration, put it this way, in the U.S. Do you have any concern over the Keystone XL pipeline? Do you believe that this administration will go to sort of cancel the project? Especially when energy is needed and most needed for economic rebound?
Well, what I know about that is that the prime minister raised the issue with the president-elect, and that the prime minister's phone call, I think, was the first foreign leader phone call that the president-elect received. And the project, as I understand it, is not the same as it was, several years ago. That a number of measures have been taken with respect to partnerships with First Nations, with respect to carbon reduction and that sort of thing. So I think it's an active conversation as between the two governments, and an important one.
What is your greatest concern with the current government here in Canada as far as response when it comes to rebounding? Where do you think that the hardship is going to be? Where the government is not really performing or having difficulty?
The biggest risk, I think, for governments, whether they're local, state, provincial, federal, on either side of the border, is this tendency to try to go it alone. I think pulling back from each other is a risk, whether it's Canada pulling back from the United States or vice versa. That's what we really worry about, and that's why we started the rebound effort.
So you mentioned protectionism is a problem, and I do agree. And in the meantime, we're hearing on the other side that we need to have some kind of protectionism made in whatever campaign in order to be able to fight the climate. So basically, that's trade. Do you agree to that? What do you think of this kind of statement?
I think it's really important to do both. So I don't think we can turn away from our interconnectivity from a trade point of view, but we also, of course, have to work with countries around the world and with civil society to deal with the climate initiative. So I think it's important to do both. And I think you'll see, for example, President-elect Biden has appointed John Kerry, or has announced his intention to name John Kerry to deal with global climate issues and to try to bring the U.S. back into the Paris Accord. And I think that's enormously meaningful.
How much time I have left?
1 minute.
Okay. Back to the Keystone. Of course, we are very concerned about that. Do you believe that? And I will repeat that question again. Do you believe that we can do economic rebound without keeping the focus on energy, at least for the time, the foreseen time, which is talking a couple of decades down the road?
Well, labor unions share the view that we have to have infrastructure and energy infrastructure and all sorts of projects in order for the economic recovery to move forward. So I do think it's important that Canada, United States, labor unions, businesses, civil society cooperate on that front.
Thank you very much. On to Mr. Dhaliwal for 5 minutes.
Unmute.
We are so used to automatically unmuting, so hit 20 seconds gone. Madam Chair, thank you to the presenters. In March, we have new measures aimed on, at slowing the spread of COVID. COVID-19 has significantly affected how people do their shopping. Consumer make retail price purchases, and the businesses do business in the market by retail e-commerce sales, being going up every day. So I would like to know uh, uh, what are some of the different e-commerce trends observed across industries in the retail trade sector and positive impact it had. Second question will be how the businesses, especially the SMEs, adapt to more digital economy and advance e-commerce to support their products. And thirdly, what can government do to help small businesses to take advantage of the online opportunities?
Ms. Greenwood, did you want to go take a shot at that?
Sure. Thank you so much. So on the question of SMEs and conversion to digital commerce and what they need to do, I think it's a very important point. I mean, first of all, we know that small businesses are the bulk of the economy around the world. So it is very important that we focus on them. The There are companies, whether it's a company like Cisco or a company like Microsoft or many others, that have provided this connectivity that helps SMEs in a usually very affordable way to stay connected with their workers and their customers and all of that. But there are some things that still need to be done in person, right? And so digital commerce is an important piece of the modern economy, but you still have, manufacturing, for example, and food delivery and things like that, where digital commerce plays a role or digital connection plays a role in making things more efficient, but it doesn't substitute the entire process. I think there is a huge role. You asked about the role of government. There is a huge role of government in terms of investing in keeping economies going. We have to keep people afloat, or the economy isn't going to withstand. So we saw, in the United States, the Federal Reserve, the central banks, the U.S. government, Congress, both parties, and the administration take extraordinary steps at the beginning of the pandemic. There's debate right now about how much more they need to spend, but you can bet on the new incoming Congress, the new administration, having this as their first order of business in January, which is how much investment do they need to pour into the economy to keep particularly small businesses afloat. That's an enormously important question.
Thank you. My question to Ms. McEwen. You were talking about CERB rental assistance provided by the government and the wage subsidy. And now you know that this wage subsidy of 75% to the employers has been, and the rental assistance program, the new one that brought forward that tenants can directly take advantage of that program, is extended to spring of 2021. Do you see small businesses taking advantage of that program, or is there any modification that we should have made to those two programs that will help the small and medium-sized businesses?
Thank you. I think I think it's been really difficult for small businesses. I know that at first, there was you were offering to lend money of $40,000. So I think extending any loans, if that hasn't already been done, and extending deadlines because the economy hasn't rebounded fast enough for anybody to be able to remake that principle. And so wherever there have been loans extended, definitely you should give people more breathing room on that front, I think, and wherever it can be simplified, or that there can be more support from like going through the regional agencies, which was talked about in the recent fiscal update, in order to provide more support, because I think it is quite confusing for a small business to be able to figure out what part works for them and what they need and how they can get that support.
Thank you, Ms. McEwen. On to Mr. Savard Tremblay for 2.5 minutes.
Oui, alors excusez.
Yes, sorry about that. I wanted to continue the conversation with Mr. Perez. You were talking about border mechanisms. Could we be looking at other types of controls? For example, in agreements, could there be institutions to ensure that any environmental violation would be overturned or would be liable to lawsuits? In other words, instead of that investor-state dispute settlement mechanism, could we just look at, rather than having environmental protection, but rather having actual legal consequences if they don't?
Excusez-moi.
Yes, this is what would be ideal, but in order for that to happen, we would have to be sure that during the negotiations of the chapters dealing with the environment, sustainable development, and even labor protection, there would be mechanisms in existence to strengthen these measures. There would be a need to use mechanisms for settling disputes that might arise if states didn't respect these measures. Now, up to now, what's been happening is, let's see, for example, we see it with the CUSM or CIIT, or we see the progressive aspects are very weak, and they have actually no tool to ensure compliance. We see that there's an inconsistency within the CUSM. There's no environmental or labor rights strengthening, but the European Union is asking for strengthening of these measures in the UK. So there's an inconsistency there. I hope that when we'll be debating the eventual Canada-UK agreement, that we'll be able to have a lot more emphasis placed on how to strengthen this.
Thank you very much. Sorry, Mr. Savard Tremblay, your time is up. Mr. Blakey.
Thank you very much. And I'd just like to follow up with Mr. Perez on the question of the environment as well. I'm just wondering, it seems that the first agreement that Canada is going to have in the post-pandemic world is with the United Kingdom. I'm wondering what you think when we think about the importance of addressing the ongoing climate crisis, even as we combat the pandemic. What are the kinds of things that you think need to be in a bilateral trade agreement between Canada and the UK in order for it to be an agreement that does not contribute to the problem of climate change?
Yeah, thank you so much, Mr. Blakey. And so I would say, as a start, the UK is a like-minded partner for Canada. We saw actually yesterday, this morning, that the UK has committed to a emission reduction of 68% below 1990 levels for 2030. So it is a partner whom you could speak about climate action in an ambitious manner. That means that there is certainly room for greater enforceability of sustainable development chapters just like Mr. Savard Tremblay mentioned earlier, not see that as a protectionist approach, but rather see that as the floor of an economic relation that is respectful of the environment, health, and the rights of workers. So for me, that's a start. It is a country with whom you could speak about those issues. You got to make it clear that the relationship that we built with the UK is also one that you could pass on to the economic relationships that you could have with the EU and the United States to build that kind of global cohesion when it comes to making sure that the climate regime and the trade regime work together to achieve climate goals.
Hey, thank you very much. Sorry, Mr. Blakey, time is up. Thank you very much, Ms. Greenwood, Ms. McEwen, Mr. Perez, for your valuable information. The witnesses are now invited to leave the Zoom meeting, and thank you very much until we see each other again.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, members of the committee.
Thank you
Stay
so much
well.
for the opportunity.
you.